Dave Jones is with us, and Dave, for our audience, can you kind of give them a background of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, for my day job, I'm a sysadmin. I've been a sysadmin / programmer for 25 years going on, and I guess that's relevant to what our project is now, just because Adam and I got to know each other, about 10 years ago, at least now, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And so we were in the same circles of tech stuff. And so we got to know each other. And because I was a sysadmin and a programmer as well, we ended up just doing a bunch of projects together. And that's kind of my background as it relates to, the podcast index and that kind of thing.
So how does the conversation about the podcast 2.0 and the podcast index, how does that all get started? Just Adam giving you a call, or it sounded at least in one of the podcasts like there was a couple other people involved too, or was it just the two of you?
It was pretty much the two of us. Yeah, we brought in a third partner just to help us. Both of us are very disorganized, and we're like, well, there has to be money involved here at some point, so we need somebody that will keep us straight and not let us do crazy things. So we brought Eric in, and he just does back office stuff and helps us keep everything legal and straight, and he's the business guy while we go out and try to wreck things. But we got started. Adam just called me one day or texted me and said, hey, I've got an idea, which, if you know him, is not an uncommon thing. He's got a million ideas at light speed. So that wasn't out of the ordinary. And so
he explains to you what this idea is, which is what?
Well, his thing was, and I don't know how familiar you or your audience would be with No Agenda. I'm sure you are, at least a little bit. So, his show has always been possible because he shuns advertising and just goes directly to his audience. And the value for value model is what he calls it. And so, the idea being that if you're directly supported by your listeners without an intermediary, then you make yourself and your content safer from censorship. And so he had the idea first to give all of podcasting that possibility, to try to essentially break podcasting free from this layer of censorship that it has, which really is advertising. That, like most media, podcasting has ended up in an advertising model for funding. And so he's like, let's try to take the value for value model that No Agenda has been so successful with, and make it doable for all of podcasting. So that was one of his ideas. And that, let's see, the other idea was to have a censorship-free index, which could make that possible. So a podcast directory, where you could take that value for value model and not just apply it to podcasters, but also apply it to app developers. And our feeling has been since day one, and this is what we discussed when he very first brought this up, is that app developers have been left out of the value chain. And so you've got hosting companies that can make money and do. You have podcasters that have various degrees of success with podcasting, but at least a fair percentage of them do make money. But the podcast app developers, you really only have a couple of independent app developers that make any money at all. And the rest of the podcast app landscape really just has survived on in-app purchases or 99 cents on an app store. And so we tried to basically make all of the podcast world accessible to that value for value direct donation model. And so that required us to have an index for that reason, but also an open API for the apps to hook into, so that as we developed these technologies, what we're kind of loosely calling podcasting 2.0, as we developed that stuff, we could have a place to push it and allow people to hook in and get early access to cool technology like chapters, funding, the value block, all those kinds of things that we've been involved in. And so that's the framework that we talked about from the very beginning.
So what's your vision of how this plays out? Right now, it looks like you're gathering podcasts and getting the information out about what it is. So what is your vision of how? Is it a website that people go to, or it's easily understood, or how do you get it so that the masses can easily understand it? What's your vision for that?
We may be the worst possible people to create something that the masses can understand and easily hook into.
Okay.
that is not a good track record for us. But I think so. The goal here is not a website. I mean, we almost have one by necessity. The real goal is the API, which is what the podcast apps hook into. And so that really doesn't need any, to be functional, it doesn't need any sort of presence on a web page at all. So at the application level, we're pushing data to those apps and to allow them to function as a podcast player. The issue here is that the podcasting world is open and decentralized by its nature, which is what we're trying to preserve through technologies like RSS. We're trying to save that aspect of podcasting to keep it from being taken over by Spotify or these siloed private companies that want to basically take podcasts and stick them behind a paywall. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to take that technology and put a free API in there where app developers can hook into that and not have to run their own infrastructure. Because the downside to the open, decentralized podcasting world is that it can be very difficult to aggregate, let's just say, 1.5 million podcast feeds. That means you have to have servers that are constantly reading those feeds as fast as possible and indexing them into a database and then serving them up in a way that your app can understand. And for a lot of independent app developers who have no promise of making money at all, other than maybe 99 cents if they're lucky, the idea of running enough infrastructure on the back end, which may cost them $400 or $500 a month, that would be tough. That would be a tough sell, because who knows how many months they're going to have to go like that before they get any audience buy-in at all. So we said, well, why don't we make the infrastructure, and then we're going to give it away for free, and just eating our own dog food, that value for value model. We'll give it away for free, and then if it's helpful to app developers, if it helps them to get customers and it works out to where they're making money, well, maybe they'll give back to us and donate back to help the whole ecosystem.
Is it a big investment for you guys to get this thing going?
It's not cheap. It's costing us roughly around $350 a month right now.
Okay.
Of hosting fees. In the first couple of months, we paid for that out of our own pockets, and then in the last 3 months, we've had enough donations coming in to cover our costs. Now, I mean, the goal here was never to walk away with a lot of money.
Sure.
If we're able to cover our costs with hosting, that's really what we're aiming for. We just don't want to lose money, obviously.
Right.
But so far, so many people have stepped up to the table and given donations, and we've not had to pay out of pocket for the last 3 months, and so it's been great.
That's great. So from the podcaster standpoint, how are you going to make it easier for them to get donations quickly from their listeners that, they're in a position where they don't need advertisers, or they don't need to go through programmatic, or they don't need to figure out who to call to get somebody to help them sell ads because they're busy putting their content together? How do you make that work?
Yeah, and that's the moonshot aspect of this. So the idea here is, in order for that to really happen in a way that's well, let me back up. There's two parts to that. Number one is you have to take the payment processing out of the flow as much as you can, because that's where the hit happens. That's where your PayPals, Patreons, and those guys, when they get involved, you're looking at 10%
Right.
off the top, and so and you're also looking at a potential point for censorship. And we've seen this. I mean, to use an extreme example lately, look at Pornhub. They got completely demonetized by Visa. And it's not just a Patreon or somebody like that can demonetize you. In their case, it was the actual credit card processor themselves. And it didn't matter who that intermediary was. That's going to go all the way up the chain to the actual bank processing. And so our idea is, in order to make a decentralized donation support model work, you really need to take all of that out of the chain if you can. And the only thing that does that really is crypto, is Bitcoin. And so Adam had been reading about a technology called Lightning, which is basically what they call a layer 2 protocol that sits on top of Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin Lightning network allows you to do very fast transactions, very small transactions, because it works what they call off-chain. So these are not standard Bitcoin transactions. They are transactions that happen off of the blockchain in small increments, and then they get settled up later in what's called a channel. And so he was reading about this technology, and we started putting some stuff together and just checking it out to see if it would be viable. And about a month and a half or so after we launched the index, we were able to prove out that type of system would work. And so the idea here is that in your RSS feed, the way this looks in practical terms, to try to speak clearly here, is in your RSS feed for your podcast, you can put a tag in there that lists out all of the various Bitcoin Lightning addresses that need to get paid as somebody listens to the podcast. And so the idea would be that podcast applications, player applications, would read that tag in the RSS feed, and then once a minute, they would begin to stream payment back to the podcaster, because the podcaster has put in there his or her Lightning payment address. And so once a minute, you're getting however many fractions of a Bitcoin the listener has determined that your podcast is worth, what they want to pay for it. And let's just say that's 10 Satoshis. A Satoshi is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin. So let's just say that's 10 Satoshis. Well, every minute, 10 Satoshis are getting paid back to that podcaster directly into their Bitcoin wallet. And so we've proved that out, that it works. And through some guys that we have hooked up with at the Sphinx.chat app, they have a Lightning. They already had a Lightning chat app, and so they essentially just dropped Podcast Player into that app, and immediately we were able to hook up everything to the API, to the index, the podcast index, and begin streaming money. And it works. I mean, we're doing it every single day now. It's a future looking technology, but it also works right now. It's just a little complicated to get into.
Are you going to be able to make it work with cash, being that a lot of people not only don't understand a Bitcoin, they probably don't buy any or have any or exchange any. So how do you make that work with cash for the podcaster?
That's kind of universally known in the in the Bitcoin world as the onboarding problem. It's like there's so many cool Bitcoin things that are hampered by the fact that it's a challenge to get Bitcoin in from cash. So we decided at the beginning, we're not going to try to get into that if we can help it. Now, that doesn't mean that we're completely avoiding that, because one thing that we're doing right now is we've been talking to somebody that it's not I'm not ready to talk about it publicly, but we've been talking to a Lightning provider, and the ideas here are for them to handle a dollar to Bitcoin conversion process. So the great thing about this is the Bitcoin community is so zealous. They love things like this. Anything that causes cryptocurrency, and specifically Bitcoin, to be more accessible and more usable. Yeah, they love a challenge like that. So as soon as it became known that we were involved in this space, the Bitcoin guys just jumped in there with both feet, and we're like, yeah, we want to do this. And so we've just been contacted by everybody. Yeah. And, so I don't think that, I think that's going to be a solved problem. I think it's going to be a solved problem fairly quickly.
Great. So you mentioned the podcast apps also making money in this new way of doing this. So how do they are they taking a piece of the podcasters' revenue, or is it some other way they'd be making money?
Yeah, and that's one thing that we've talked about since the beginning, is that it's not, this doesn't work if everybody doesn't get a piece of that action. I mean, everybody in the podcast world, nobody needs to be left out of that, because the truth is everybody contributes to this in some way. The app, the aggregator, the index, the podcaster, the hosting company. There's so many people in the chain that everybody needs to be able to have a piece of that. And so the way that the value block is what we call it, the way the value tag works in the new podcast namespace, is you can just specify this. You specify, okay, these four Lightning addresses are going to get paid every minute, and one of them may be 98, and you specify a percentage. So let's just say 97%. You say 97% of the payment each minute is going to go to the podcaster, which is me. 1% is going to go to the app. 1% is going to go to the hosting company. 1% is going to go to this API that I'm using. And so you can specify all the different people in the chain that you would like to see get paid. Gotcha. And so for the apps, we're recommending like a 1% split. And but the interesting thing is it's a new market, so who knows what that'll end up as. If you leave that in the listener's hands, they may really love your app, and they may say, well, yeah, I want to give you an extra 5% on top of that. And so as soon as you take, that's an interesting thing too. As soon as you take out this idea that there's a set price for this one particular service, and you move to that mindset of the value for value, where you say, I'm going to give you this value, and you give me back what you think is worth, whatever that is. If it's 5 cents or if it's $500, I'm not going to tell you what to give me. You give back to me what you think it's worth. Right. When you put those tools in somebody's hands, it's amazing what people will do. I mean, we just in the short lifespan of our show, of our podcast, that we do a weekly podcast on Fridays called Podcasting 2.0, that is basically just a running, Adam calls it the board meeting, because we don't usually talk during the week much. But if you take that show, for example, that's been running since August, I mean, some weeks we get, $10 of donations, and another week we may get, $1,500. But it's just a matter of what people heard that week, what they saw us do, and how much they thought that was worth to them and the rest of the ecosystem. So, you guys have been gaining some traction with with companies like I think Libsyn is one, and companies like that to get more podcasts in the index. Correct? I mean, what is it that you can talk about it in terms of companies that are known right now? That's pretty much. I don't think there's anybody that's not known at this point. It's Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Blueberry, they're developing, they're spending some dev time right now to get hooked into our stuff. Captivate, Transistor, Fireside. Feel like I'm leaving somebody out, but they're listed on our website under there's an apps page there that lists out everybody who has connections to us. But one of the things that we're trying to do is, it seems a little weird to have Apple be sort of the main directory for podcasting when they're also a private company, a big, humongous private company. And so the idea is that for Apple to be sort of the default directory for something that's supposed to be an open ecosystem that nobody owns and controls, we're trying to shift that center of the universe back to something that is open. Now we're not a nonprofit, but you can literally listen to our show and hear how much money we have. I mean, we spell it out every week. So we're saying, well, we're not a nonprofit, but we're extreme transparency in our financials. Yeah. So if you listen to the show, you can see exactly what's going on. We're transparent. We build everything in the open on our podcastindex.social is the name of our social website, where us and all the developers that are in the project participate. And so we're trying to shift that universe back from having a private company sort of running podcasting infrastructure to putting it back into a more open community-led effort.
I heard Adam teasing Apple a few times. Do you need to have them in there, or does it really matter if they're in there? Because really, you're going to have all the other hosting companies anyway, and they're all basically feeding Apple the same stuff. Or does it matter?
Yeah. Well, Apple's very interested. They know what's going on here, and Adam's talked to them a few times, and there's absolutely no animosity at all. Those guys are great, and they're going to get involved whenever they feel like it's right. And so, but we don't have any real need for them to be involved at this point, right. Other than just it would help with adoption of the namespace. Sure. Because there's sort of these are two kind of I guess parallel projects that feed off each other. There's the Podcast Index, which is the API, and that's the effort to make a decentralized, non-Apple centric, or really it's not just Apple, non-corporate centric index that can't that's free of censorship. And then there's the podcast namespace, which supports that effort, but also is usable way outside of us. Like all the technologies that we talked about, like the value tag, transcripts, funding, chapters, all these things that we're doing, everything we do is all in the podcast namespace. And that doesn't depend on the podcast index. That's completely usable outside of us.
Talk about the tags a little bit so that people that are listening or that are reading this understand what you're doing with tags and why it might be important to the average podcast.
Yeah, and that's interesting because RSS is an old technology and it's very extensible. You can add new things to it very easily through what they call namespaces. And but the funny thing about it is that technology is so hidden from the modern podcaster that a lot of times they just don't even know about their feed or what's in it or anything like that and don't care, which is fine. That's not for them to care about necessarily. But when you begin to add new things to RSS to extend it, you do have to have some sort of knowledge about that, because there may be stuff in there that you want. So the podcast namespace is our effort to take a lot of the things that the podcasting world has been wanting for many years and just do it. Because what we found early on was that podcasting has the decentralized nature of it that we've talked about leaves it open to just no progress. There's a lot of people that sit around and talk about, hey, podcasting ought to have this, but they don't ever do anything. Or a lot of times things get tied up in standards groups, or, standards bodies, or working groups, or 501c3 nonprofits are formed in order to look at doing something, but nothing ever actually gets done. And so we said, well, let's just do it. I mean, why not? Let's try it. And so we put together a namespace with 5 of the tags that we knew immediately that people had been talking about and wanting for a long time. And one of those was the lock tag to, that wasn't one that had been wanted for a long time. That's one that we kind of cooked up, but that was an idea of being able to lock your feed so that people can't import it or pirate your feed.
Okay.
There was the transcript tag, which Buzzsprout had already been working on and already had sort of a working open spec for, but it was only usable between Buzzsprout and one app. So we said, okay, well, let's refine that and stick that in the namespace, and then everybody can use it. So we've got the transcript tag, the funding tag, which is an attempt to simplify a few other tags that existed to try to point people at donation links like PayPal or Patreon. And then you got logged, funding, transcript, and chapters, the chapters tag. And the chapters tag is our effort to take chapters out of the MP3 file itself, because that's typically the way it's done now. If you want to put chapters in your show, you typically have to bake it into the MP3 audio file. And so that's fine, but it's a little bit inflexible, because once you upload the show, if you want to remaster it or something like that, it can be difficult, a lot of heavy lifting to rearrange that audio, the frame headers and that kind of thing, in a way that doesn't break. So we said, well, let's take the chapters out of the MP3 file itself and stick it in a separate file that can be included with the RSS feed. And so now this allows for rich chapter building tools to be created that don't have to touch the audio. They can exist alongside the hosting company's user interface tools and allow you to create the chapters after the fact, after you upload your audio. And so you could listen along and add the chapters as you go. So that was the other tag that we came up with, and that was what we call phase 1 of the podcast namespace, is putting those tags in.
Before you go on to the next piece of what you wanted to say, the chat. Let's just say I'm a podcaster. I use Spreaker to host my site, and I want to insert chapters into my show because I don't have chapters now. Tell me how I do that now with your technology.
To use the podcast namespace with Spreaker, you would have to beg them to do it. Essentially, you'd have to get them to adopt, because we have not heard from them. Currently, Buzzsprout. Let's just say you want to do chapters. Buzzsprout supports that. Fireside supports that. Transistor supports that. Captivate supports that, or I think Captivate's doing it right now. Blueberry. So one of those hosting companies we mentioned before have all committed to adopting those namespace tags. They either already have them or they're about to have them, and they're going to have the tools to do it. If you're with Spreaker, you just want to contact them and tell them to do it, because that's how they need to find out about this stuff. Right. They need to hear from their customers.
So if I go onto the website, can I upload my show myself and become, even though it's hosted on Spreaker, it doesn't work that way. The hosting company has to be part of this.
Yeah, we do not do any hosting or processing of the podcast in any way. All we do on the index side of things is we're an aggregator and a back end for apps, and then we also have spearheaded the namespace project. So basically what happens is once a new tag is finalized, we put support for it into the index software, so that now we pick up that data and we're able to hand it back to the apps that use our service. but we don't process or manage the
Gotcha.
audio or hosting or any of that stuff. Yeah.
So if I was with Libsyn or Blueberry and we were down the road and everything was humming, then I would go on their website where I upload my show, and something different is going to be there that wasn't there 6 months ago that will help me figure out chapters and figure out transcript, because they're going to make it easy for the average podcaster who has no clue how to do any of this. They just want to do a show. It's going to be on their site.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the way it is with if you're hosted on Buzzsprout right now, all those things are there, and you just
because of you guys, because they've incorporated your technology.
Right. That's exactly right. And so you have all, and same with Fireside. If you go to Fireside, all that stuff's there. Transistor. If you log into your account, you'll see those things there available for you to put into your show. Yeah.
Got it. So so take us, like, what's down the road here? I mean, how do you feel like it's done? Or, I'm sure it's never going to be done, but what is your vision of saying, we've got it to the point where it's, is it going to be that it's being mass used by all the hosting companies, or is it going to be something that you finished writing? How's it going to feel somewhat finished?
I think it's the way I envision it going, and I think you've seen this already, is that there's a flurry of activity at the beginning because a lot of this stuff is just pent up demand. People have been wanting like a location tag, a way to put let's just say if you're doing a podcast about Western Africa, people want to be able to somehow tag West Africa in their podcast so that other search engines, podcast search engines and podcast indexes can aggregate that stuff together and say, here's all the popular podcasts about West Africa, or here's all the podcast episodes that have talked about the Eiffel Tower. So you have this idea of location tagging within podcasting is something that has been wanted for a while. And so we've put that into phase 2. So that's going to be a tag that will be finalized within the next couple of months. And then people within the user tools of their host can tag a location in their feed. So there's things like that are pent up demand for information to be included, that we just are saying, okay, let's just do it. Let's push it in there, make sure it looks good, and let's get the ball rolling on that. But as those sort of low hanging fruit, as those things come, get in there and get baked in and get finalized, there will be fewer and fewer of those. And so then I think the activity will fall off, but that'll be good though, because that'll let, at least for us, for our vision, that will let us focus more on that second goal, which is trying to get the podcasting world less dependent on advertising. And that's a harder problem to solve, clearly, than putting some tags in the namespace. But I really hope by the end of the year, I hope by the end of 2021 that we'll have a very robust namespace, and that we'll have, I hope that we have a lot of hosts on board. We already do have a lot, but I think if at the end of the 2021, if we had a really nice namespace with a lot of accessible new things that people could put in their podcast, and let's just say 50% of the hosts on board, I would be very happy.
Great. So do you think there's really a big desire for transcripts and chapters and things like that? Is it really something that's important to podcasters, or is it a small group of podcasters and people in the industry that are asking about those? And what's your thought on that? Are those, or is it good to have a choice for them to be able to put it in there so that it will help grow their show and they just don't know it? Or what's the reason for including those things?
Well, what we've seen, it's an interesting question, because I think it's sort of a mix of all of that. Because what we've seen is, number one, hosters are going to do, they're going to implement what their customers are asking for. And so if their customers are not asking for location data to be in their podcast, well, they're probably just not going to do it. They're not going to put that, they're not going to spend the developer time to put that stuff in there. And so that's sort of one way to answer that question. Another thing to think about is that the more, how do I say this? The podcasting ecosystem, the open free podcasting ecosystem, is sort of locked in a trench warfare right now with specifically Spotify, because Spotify is buying up, they're buying up large portions of podcasting right now. And those private apps that don't play ball with the rest of podcasting, they have the potential to do all kinds of interesting things in the app. They can do these things like location, person search, people search, transcripts. They can do all of those things. Now a lot of them don't yet, but they will. And if the open podcast ecosystem is not prepared to have feature parity with what the private siloed apps can do, well, then that's a problem. It will kill slowly the open podcasting world. So the other way to answer that is just, we need these things just to maintain relevance and feature parity and innovation in this space. And then I guess the final way to look at it is, yes, there are plenty of customers who are podcasters who want this information. But there's also plenty of podcasters that want it, but don't know they want it because it's cool stuff that they could put in there, but they just may not know that they're missing it,
So lastly, what do you want the average podcaster to know or do that will help?
I would say that number one would be go check out some of the apps that support this stuff. One would be Podfriend, which is a web-based app. I think it's just podfriend.com. Another one would be Podverse.fm. Another one would be Hypercatcher. That's on iOS. Podcast Addict supports some of the tags already. Go check out some of those apps that support the tags and look at how they work and look at the cool stuff that they can do, because it's kind of it's really a different experience. So when you're looking at, let's just say, if you're looking at the No Agenda Show on Hypercatcher app or on Podfriend, you're seeing in real time as things are being talked about on the show, you're seeing pictures come up, images that they're talking about, articles come up. I mean, it's almost like being in a slot in a PowerPoint presentation. It's pretty amazing. And once you get like person in the person tag, the new person tag, or the location tag, you can come up with all kinds of rich, immersive data in a podcast. And it's a real different experience. And so I think one thing I would say is go check out some of those apps and what they can do. And the other thing would be, if you think that stuff is really cool and it's something that you would want to put in your podcast, well, then ask your host if they're not one of the ones that participate yet. And then what we have seen is it does not take much to convince a host to jump on board with this, because the podcast hosting world is very competitive. And so if somebody's wanting something, and, if let's just say that you're at Spreaker and one of your customers are seeing all this cool stuff happening over at Buzzsprout, well, then you need to support that. You may lose customers that way.
Right.
So I would say those things. Go check out what it can do, and then go talk to your host.
And make sure that please push the podcast so people can listen in. I mean, every Friday, I think, it comes out, right? Or once a week, you and Adam talk about exactly what's going on. So let everybody know when that is again.
It's Podcasting 2.0 is the name of the show. We're not on Apple or Spotify or any of that stuff.
You're not.
It's an RSS feed, so we're eating our own dog food, man. So you'll have to go get the RSS feed from our homepage, which is podcastindex.org, and manually plug it into your podcast app. Yeah, it's every Friday. That's right.